Thanks, Michael. Good afternoon. This is the dreaded post-lunch slot. So we'll do what we can to keep you all awake. Take a note from Diane. I think, as Michael said, I'm with the Export-Import Bank of the U.S., and which is the export credit agency for the United States. And as such, we align with the OECD requirements for environmental, the common approaches on the environment, and some of the other requirements. So when we're talking about some of our policies and whatnot, that's the foundation of that. And part of that is taking on board the World Bank Group safeguard policies as well as the IFC performance standards. So that's sort of an underpinning to some of what we're talking about. Wanted to just, all right, the button worked. Start out with, Ex-Im Bank has been dealing with greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide emissions, particularly with fossil fuel energy projects for quite some time. And we've endeavored to formalize how we look at these things, calculating amounts and some of CO2 emissions and that sort of thing. Over the past year, we've taken on, raised it up a notch, brought it up a notch to try to deal with more specifically with a group of fossil fuel energy projects that are high carbon emitters, or what we're calling is high carbon intensity fossil fuel projects. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. But just to kind of step back and go through some of the milestones, if you will, of Ex-Im's efforts with respect to greenhouse gases, we first began calculating and tracking greenhouse gas emission amounts on, as I said, the fossil fuel projects that we were considering since 1999, as well as the renewable energy projects that and exports that we have supported. We began reporting those results as an aggregate in our annual report starting in 2000. In February 2009, we began reporting on a project-by-project basis on our pending transactions website the estimated greenhouse gas emissions for, again, fossil fuel projects or any project, I should say, any project that produces greater than 50,000 tons CO2 equivalent per year. And that has its own little column in our transaction website, and you can see that there. At any given time, there'll be 2 to 6 projects that'll have the greenhouse gas, the carbon dioxide equivalents, as well as we'll be talking a little bit about the carbon intensity for the project. In November of last year, Ex-Im developed and adopted a broad-based carbon policy, which is a greenhouse gas policy, which was, and as such, we were the first ECA to implement or to adopt such a policy. And we'll talk just a little bit more of that in a second. In March of this year, we adopted and went forward with one of our elements of our implementation plan for that policy, which was to define guidelines and the additional requirements for high carbon intensity fossil fuel projects. The policy, the carbon policy, which, as I said, was adopted last year and about this time last year, it had 3 main focuses or emphases: to increase financing of very low to zero carbon dioxide emitting and renewable energy exports, to increase the support for exports that contribute to significant increases in energy efficiency, and to increase transparency in tracking and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions in the projects that Ex-Im supports. And there's a link, and I understand you'll have access to this. There is a link to that policy on our website that's there. As I said, the carbon policy implementation plan included these additional requirements for dealing with and the way we would handle high carbon intensity fossil fuel projects. Ex-Im's environmental policy is embodied in its environmental procedures and guidelines. And as I mentioned earlier, these are driven primarily by we utilize the benchmarking of the World Bank safeguard policies more often with the IFC performance standards. What we the bank did in March of this year was to add another annex, which is entitled the Supplemental Guidelines for High Carbon Intensity Projects, to deal with this group of energy projects, power plant projects principally. It spells out the requirements for these high carbon intensity projects, including the specifics on the information that's needed to conduct an enhanced due diligence that to address the greenhouse gas implications of a pending project. And again, this is the link there is to the environmental procedures and guidelines, including this Annex G. What we're calling an enhanced due diligence process basically is defined by the Annex G, and it basically will include several components, and it'll be focusing on, and the exact nature of the due diligence process will be triggered by the amounts of greenhouse gases emitted per unit power generated, what we're calling the carbon intensity, in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour. Or this is, I guess, the same as kilograms of carbon dioxide per megawatt. So in any case, in Annex G, we define two important thresholds that trigger additional consideration. The first one is our definition of high carbon intensity project, and those are ones that produce greater than about 700 grams CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. This will trigger the entire closer scrutiny that is defined in Annex G. The second threshold defines projects above which is 850 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, above which projects would be required to come up with some offsetting activity or offset to bring it below 850. Otherwise, the bank would not consider financing. We base these thresholds, and I guess it's, as you can see in the parenthetical there, we base it on available data that came to us through EPA. There's some information in the IFC Performance Standard 3, some other sources, and basically found it breaks that made sense in terms of. I mean, it is somewhat arbitrary in the sense that a 700 grams per kilowatt hour, is that really below that? Is that low carbon intensity, and above that high carbon? We found what we thought was a break in the emissions, carbon dioxide emissions associated with different kinds of fossil fuel technologies. Similarly, with the 850 threshold, above which we'd either not finance or would require offsetting, we found that seemed to be approximately the division between subcritical pulverized coal, maybe low efficiency, high fuel oil type power plants. That was what we were targeting. As you see in the parenthetical, we're taking a hard look at this because we really have, as you'll see in a few minutes, we really have only applied it in a couple instances, and we're going to see just where what the result of all this is. And as I said, at this point, it only this Annex G, the high carbon intensity process, only applies to the fossil fuel power sector, and essentially taking the threshold from the IFC's EHS guideline for power plants, thermal power plants. We're using, it has to be greater than 50 megawatts. Basically, what the Annex G, if we've triggered this high carbon intensity enhanced due diligence process, it triggers an analysis that is to be provided in a report prepared by the sponsors, by the project, what we call the greenhouse gas study, that will address 5 main areas. Basically, we need a detailed computation of the projected greenhouse gases, including all of the assumptions of factors and values that are based on the reality of the project, not on, so it take into consideration the coal you expect it to be, if it's a coal-fired power plant, the fuel you'll be seeing, the technology that's going to be using, the boilers, the turbines, whatever that's specific to the project. Similarly, we would want a refined analysis of the carbon intensity, the greenhouse, the CO2 equivalents in grams of CO2 equivalents per kilowatt hour. Again, looking very closely, and that's something we take put a great deal of scrutiny to assure that we're comfortable and agree with the numbers that are coming out there. Another key factor in this is the availability, or how much that power plant will be utilized. One of the things we find that is by powering up, powering down power plants, if you say have a 75, 85% availability, that can have a significant increase in the carbon intensity because of the process. You're spending a significant, so the way the plant is operated is also needs to be factored into this. We will look at an analysis of project alternatives, and one of the things that we're finding is that in that second bullet, and the next one is that the use of what we're calling the best appropriate technology. And by the reason we said appropriate rather than best available, there's sort of varying definitions or readings of what best available. I think the reading that it's what's appropriate to the host country, what's economically feasible, what is the best that can be basically done in the context where the project's being provided or is going to be proposed. We don't have a definition for this. This is one of the areas what we're going to, as we proceed and gain some experience with this, see what this means. But I think in many people's view, it's similar to best available technology. One of the other things that, and this is something, another area that the fourth bullet there is a demonstration of the alignment of the project with the host country's low carbon strategy. Low carbon growth strategy. We don't have a great deal of experience with this. We've been in South Africa and in India, and those were very different looking strategies, but they existed. There are other countries where they may not exist, and we haven't really had to confront how we would deal with the absence of a formal low carbon growth strategy. Nonetheless, we don't want to be crosswise, be throwing our support behind a project that isn't consistent with such a strategy. Other considerations that may be brought into this would be if there's additional carbon reductions or CO2 reducing measures, if CCS ready, which we're starting to formulate a definition for that. Other things that would be if the project sponsors have parallel development of renewable energy projects, wind or solar or something of that sort, might be brought into the consideration. This isn't it's something that, as I said, the board can consider it, but it's not a structured thing. If you don't have 10%, there's not a specific quantitative criteria. If you don't have 10% equivalent of renewable, we're not going to talk to you. It's nothing of that sort. It's just bring us anything else that you think the project sponsors think we should think about when we review this project.